Really delighted to welcome a great CoMotion friend and supporter, Beth Kigel, Vice President and Director of Smart and Connected Solutions at HNTB. Over to you, Beth.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So excited to have everyone here in Miami. I actually live in Miami, not too far from the port here, and excited to be at the port. And of course, our panel today will be focused on launching into the future of ports. We have a great panel that I'm going to introduce shortly. Before we get into our conversation here, I wanted to start with setting the stage and providing a few statistics that might help provide some context for the importance of the conversation we're going to have today. So these statistics begin a little bit more focused on the U.S. It's important to know that the United States only meets 70% of our demand with domestic supply chains. And this compares differently with other industrial countries, which is more like 80 to 90%. Our American ports are gateways for domestic and international trade. Our U.S. seaports actually handle over 99% of the country's overseas cargo by volume and 65% by value. And this is pretty significant given the fact that the value of all international trade accounts for 30% of the U.S. GDP. Specifically with Florida, seaports represent 54% of handling of our international trade, Florida's international trade, and we're seeing records in cargo transport. And the pandemic, of course, shone a bright light on the vulnerabilities overall of our supply chain and the importance of our seaports in the equation. And many of us like to talk about the entire ecosystem, the supply chain ecosystem is from ports to porch. So our supply chains are restructuring to address the vulnerabilities that really became at the forefront as we were dealing with the pandemic and are looking at many innovations to address that. Also, we can't forget about passengers. When we had our prep discussion, our panelists reminded me, of course, that what's happening with passengers and passenger mobility in and out of our ports is also very important. And, there was a significant downturn, obviously, because of the pandemic, but the expectation for 2023 for global cruise passengers, the actual forecast, is expected to be 106% of what it was in 2019. So it's definitely bouncing back, and the estimate is about 31.5 million passengers. Florida, by chance, has all of the major cruise lines operating here, I think, and it's about 60% of the national market. So interesting conversations that we can have in terms of what does that mean to our local economy, safety, et cetera, but also shore power, and we'll get into some of that discussion as well. The other thing to keep in mind is this isn't just about moving goods in and out by sea. These are intermodal hubs. And so very important and critical part of the entire ecosystem. So with all of this growth that we have to address, there comes great opportunity. And we're going to have a wonderful dialogue about that today. So I want to introduce, just at a very high level, our panelists today. We actually have, immediately to my left, we have Andy Hecker, who is Deputy Director and CFO of PortMiami. Andy, thank you, and thank you for hosting us today. We have Jonathan Daniels, who's the CEO and Port Director of Port Everglades. If you're not familiar with Port Everglades, that's just up the road a ways in the greater Fort Lauderdale area. We also have with us Nick DeAndre, who's the CEO of GridMatrix, and Kurt Honold, who is the Secretary of Economy and Innovation for the state of Baja, California, Mexico. And it'll be really interesting to hear what Kurt has to say about the greenfield opportunity they have there. So without further ado, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to turn this over to our panelists for self-introductions. They could share a little bit about themselves, but also the organization they represent and some of your priorities. So, Andy, why don't we begin with you?
Got one right here. Thank you, Beth. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to PortMiami. Thank you, Fred.
Security.
We're gonna have to give equal time to everyone in the applause category.
Problem with that is Fred's in charge of security.
I know.
Deputy Director, CFO. I've been in supply chain and logistics basically my whole life. Just very quickly, been here about 10 years. I was at Port of Virginia for about 6-7 years before that. And then I ran supply chain consulting for a section of the country at Ernst & Young. PortMiami, we're a department of Miami-Dade County, and I know most of you heard Mayor Daniela Levine's welcoming comments this morning. At the simplest level, our mission is to provide a conduit, the entry, the gateway for cargo and cruise activity that generates economic benefits, jobs, and employment. But it's also extremely important that our department and our organization fit into more of the community landscape, and whether it's resiliency, sustainability, emissions reductions, transit-oriented development, and how do we connect these people to these places, in addition to the movement of cargo. In our DNA, we really fit into that. And as we go on, we'll talk about some projects and some of the efforts that we have along those lines. And then my friend Jonathan.
Ditto. What PortMiami does in so many respects. Port Everglades and PortMiami are almost one large port, separated by 26 miles. Essentially, it makes us two distinct terminals. And in so many ways, neither port can handle the amount of people or the flow of cargo that's necessary to support the consumption zone that is South Florida. So we actually work together in many respects. We see different lines, different trade lanes that allow us the opportunity to open up the world, whether it's east-west trade, whether it's north-south trade. Certainly the position of Port Everglades and PortMiami make us favored when it comes to movement down into the Caribbean Basin as well as the Central and South America. But we've seen an increase in Asian and the east-west trade, whether it's coming out of Southeast Asia, whether it's coming out of India, whether it's coming out of the Mediterranean with some new markets that are exposing the shippers, the carriers to different global markets. For those of you that don't know anything about Port Everglades, no, we have nothing to do with that ecological wonder that's about 25 miles to the west of us. But we are the third busiest cruise home port, following Miami as well as Port Canaveral. We are the #1 fuel port. And those of you that live down in this area, if you want to talk about resiliency, and you want to talk about the importance of trade and flow of goods and services and of cargo, those of you that were down here in the middle of April and saw 26 inches in the period of 7 hours, if you want to find the importance of any particular industry, strip it out for a period of time and you find out how important that is. We found that out during the cruise when we weren't slowed down, we were shut down. I've had the opportunity to work within a couple of other ports, spent the previous 7 years. Been in Port Everglades now for 3 years. Came in during the pandemic. What a wonderful time to come into the third busiest cruise home port in the world. But spent the previous 7 years as the executive director and port director of the Mississippi State Port Authority in Gulfport, Mississippi. I've been to ports as far north as Eastport, Maine. And if you don't know where Eastport, Maine is, go as far north and east in the United States, and you look beyond that, and it's Canada. Those of you who have maybe been there, maybe in July or August, wonderful time to go. January, February, terrible time to go. But I also approach it from a little bit of a different approach. As I was the president and CEO of a large multi-county economic development agency in Maine, and also was the director of business and economic development for the city of Bangor, Maine, where I had the opportunity to oversee everything from arena and convention center operations to the international airport, as well as community development block grant, workforce development activities. So I've had a little bit of a differing background, and actually started this whole thing out as a college football coach. How does a college football coach end up as a port director? I don't have an idea, but I tell you what, it's been a fun ride.
A lot of similarities, Jonathan.
Thank you. Hand it over to you, Nick.
Yeah, of course. So it's great to be here this morning. I'm Nick DeAndre. I'm the CEO and co-founder of GridMatrix. Hopefully, I'm the voice of data and innovation on this panel. So what we do is we're a transportation analytics company, and we work with ports, cities, airports to maximize the impact of sensing and detection infrastructure that they already have. So if they have cameras or radar and inductive loops, our software will connect to it and then return them data on congestion, emissions, and safety. Most relevantly to this panel, we're in a number of cities across the United States and also various infrastructure nodes like ports or airports. But most notably, we're working with the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which is a major transit agency in New York City that manages all of New York's airports, many of the largest bridges and tunnels in and out of Manhattan, and also the Port of Newark, which is the second largest port in the United States. We're helping them with various challenges related to moving passengers, cargo, et cetera, at the port, and very excited to share some of the work that we're doing with them and how it might be applicable to all the organizations that you manage.
Good morning still to everyone here. My name is Honold. I'm from Baja California, Mexico. Applause, please. Mexico. Thank you. We have three major changes in the world in the last 20 years. One was 9/11. The other was the financial crisis in 2008. And the latest one was in 2019, the COVID crisis. COVID teaches us a lot. Something that teaches and we learn is that we depend, I'm not talking about North America, from Asia a lot, probably 100%. So what happened is that, and because Baja California, if you don't know, we're across the border with the state of California, who is the fourth economy in the world. We are in the value chain of most of the major big companies in the United States. They are in the aerospace, medical devices, and also mobility and transportation, electronics too. So because we're on the value chain, we had a big problem with not having some of the parts that needed to be a big component of the products that are being produced in Baja California. So, and the reason was because the port of Long Beach was saturated. So we had a big project in 2006 to build a new port in Ensenada, who is about 60 miles south of the border. And that port will be the sister port of Long Beach. So what we did in this new government that we have in Baja California is to revive that project and start the project again. We're not starting from ground. We have a lot of that was made at that time. But the challenge that we have, and something that I'm very excited, that's why I'm very happy to be here, is because we want this port to take everything that is happening in the world in technology, innovation, and especially what he said, and also say the Secretary of Transportation of New York, that we need to help our world to have better sustainability and also not to pollute. And in order to do that, we have to have a port that is in the new wave that has ecosystem, have artificial intelligence, also a lot of technology to move the goods very fast. In order to comply with all the demand that North America has. TMEC, that's something that is very important for Canada, Mexico, obviously United States, is that we're going to be North America very strong together. Now that we understand that we need each other, so that's why this port is going to be very important for not only to help Long Beach, but also for United States and Canada to have their goods faster, and also we can help all the companies to comply with their product to the consumer, who is the one that is buying. So very happy to be here and work and learn from you guys, because we're the new kids in the block.
And Kurt, just to clarify, your port is going to be wholly focused on the movement of goods, correct?
Yes, just moving, because the location that we have, that is very important. We're very close to the border, and also is a place where there's no people. It's very desert, let's say. So that's going to be very fast and easy to build it. And yes, we want to right now to start with yes cargo, and also everything that is in electric mobility. Hydrogen is going to be a big player in this port for clean energy. And also we understand in the future that most of the chips are going to be run either by batteries or hydrogen. So we want to look ahead and start having in our port a big plant of hydrogen, so the new chips can have the ability to use that. And also it's a lot of mines that we have in the state of Baja California that need to be moved and have to be moved either by train or by ships. So I don't know if I answered your question.
You did, and actually it's a good pivot to another question that I had, which I'm going to go right to because you mentioned hydrogen, and we talk a lot about sustainability and alternative fuels. You have a unique opportunity because you are starting from scratch, right, and looking at some of the things that are evolving. So I guess I'd like to ask our other ports, and Nick, you can chime in on this too, how you are looking at the advent of alternative fuels, including electrification, and what does that mean for your port? How are you planning for it? Can you share that with us?
Sure. Yeah, I'll start. Electrification and decarbonization has actually been in our DNA for about 10 years. We started with the cranes. Some of our container stacking equipment has recently converted from diesel to electric. We're implementing shore power starting with 5 locations on the north side where the cruise vessels come in. That's going to be turned on November, December of this year, so it's always a focus for us. When it comes to alternative fuels, we're trying to lead the way and push the envelope, as the mayor said this morning, to be positioned for the future before the future gets here. It's a complicated question. Whether it's hydrogen, whether it's ammonia, whether it's LNG, you both need storage. With Jonathan has some good opportunities with, you need a delivery system. Nobody truly knows where the winners are going to be unless you're creating hydrogen. You know, the greenfield location in Baja, and I've seen that aerial, you could create alternative fuel generation. We're not as fortunate in the urban area, so we're working on it. We'll get there. Electrification is by far and away the easiest for us, but some of our cruise vessels that come in are LNG, but we don't have a transmission line delivery system. They're handled by barge, and so for us, we'll get there. I don't know which fuels are going to ultimately be the winners. But outside of electricity, the reality is there are some, the devil's in the details, right?
Sure. Jonathan, anything you have to add to that?
You know, the ports are really being forced in many respects to respond to what the industry is telling us we need to do. And it's always been that way, whether it's berths for larger vessels, and in this case, it's now electrification, LNG as a transition fuel, whether it's green methanol, whether it's hydrogen. I think a great example is a vessel that will arrive in South Florida in late 2023 and early 2024, and that's the Silver Nova. Silver Seas is underneath the Royal Caribbean Group flag. Now, this is an LNG-powered vessel that has hydrogen fuel cells and waste to energy. That tells us right there that ultimately we don't necessarily know the direction that we are going to be forced and faced with in the next several years. All we know is we are going to have to make the investments that are necessary. Last November, I was in Madrid at an International Cruise Summit, and someone asked me about the investment on shore power. We have to make the investment in shore power. It is incumbent upon us, based on the IMO standards that these vessels now face, is that we are part of the solution. We're not all of it, but we're part of it. My fear is that 5 to 10 years from now, hydrogen's coming in, ammonia's coming in, green methanol's coming in, and it renders $150 to $200 million investment. That return on investment kind of wanes a little bit. But for right now, this is the best option for us to be able to help, to be able to decarbonize, at least on the footprint of the ports. And between the two of us, we approach 4,000 acres, and both of us are in urban centers. So when our commission last year during the budget process said, we're going to approve your budget, but I have one question. You are going to be installing and putting an emphasis on shore power, aren't you? And I said, well, Commissioner, if we want our budget passed, I guess I'm going to have to say yes. And that's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's true. It's part of the process. We have to do it. At the same time, we're on a parallel path of looking at options that are out there for us to be able to look at the next storage facilities for energy, work hand in hand with the fuel providers so that it's not just purely relegated by a barge or by a truck, but large-scale development that allows us the opportunity to be able to store these and do it in a safe manner. Because in these urban centers, we have to deal with fear. It's the fear of LNG. It's the fear of what hydrogen means. It's the fear of what that next generation of fuel brings. So it's a complicated, and it's multiple layers and multiple, it goes through a lot of disciplines in order for us to be able to get there. But it ultimately is something that we just have to do. There is no option there.
I just, before we move on, I just want to mention something that we discussed and when we were doing our preparation for this. And Jonathan, you made the statement, can you imagine 16 small cities plugging into shore power and the electric grid and the pressure that that would put on our infrastructure?
And how many terminals, cruise terminals?
So we'll have
eventually.
12.
12, 8, you have 20 terminals that are going to be flipping the switch on when those vessels come in on a Saturday or Sunday. So you have 20 small cities that are being fired up. We're looking at probably 16 megs per terminal. We may back off of that. That's a lot of power. And we need to make sure, and FPL needs to make sure that they have enough power generation capacity in order to be able to do that. So,
I was actually looking to see if I see Crystal Stiles, not to put any pressure on her, but I know she's with Florida Power and Light. She deals with these very challenges and opportunities. They're trying to get ahead of it. And I'm sure that when she speaks, she'll be addressing, some of this, because this is not the only growth in pressure on the grid. Obviously, we've been talking about electrification of vehicles and whatnot for a long time.
FBL's look at the meters are going to spin. I mean, it's an absolutely incredible revenue generator for them, and they'll be participating in the funding associated with the development of these projects.
Yes, absolutely. And Nick, what you do, you're also tracking emissions and reporting back and what have you. Anything you have to add to the conversation with what you're seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, to share some context and, maybe an admission, I feel like in many ways we're students of our own customers. The Port Authority of New York is a pretty advanced agency, and they were one of the first actually in the United States to adopt the 2050 or 2050 carbon neutrality goal, actually. And the way they think about achieving that is reducing emissions from their operations. And in some ways that could be electrifying their fleets, installing electric vehicle charging networks or chargers. They could be building LEED certified buildings, but also, and this is where I feel like we were a student, they also refer to emissions that they influence but do not directly control as level 3 emissions. And this is really important for a port like the Port of Newark, which is located in a very dense urban area. And if you have long truck queues waiting at the port, there might be bleeding into residential areas, causing traffic congestion in the surrounding areas and communities. In turn, that not just is causing emissions from idling of like the trucks that are waiting to unload and unload, but influencing traffic patterns outside of that. If the Port of Newark decides to invest in, let's say, more labor to accelerate load-unload times, being able to quantify exactly how much idling was reduced by that investment, the amount of CO2 that was reduced, is something that agency is extremely interested in understanding how to allocate capital to achieve its goals. Previously, they never had a way to measure those sorts of investments, let alone quantify their impact with respect to ROI on emissions reduction, and now they have tools to be able to do that. But for me, it was a little bit eye-opening to think about there's more to emissions reduction, let's say, than just the immediate operational changes that you can make at your own location.
Well, and since you mentioned truck queuing, I'm going to move on to the discussion of ports being multimodal hubs, right? And a lot of times we focus, I say those of us that are not as heavily engaged with ports, we think about what's happening within the gates. But there's a tremendous impact in terms of what's happening outside of their gates, both how the port impacts that, but also how all of that impacts the port. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about how you're looking at efficiencies related to that, how you're looking at partnerships related to that, And maybe, Kurt, we'll start with you from the standpoint of you get a fresh look at all this, and then we'll hear about how those that have very established infrastructure in place and processes in place are trying to tackle this as well.
Well, one of the things that for me was good to come here is to learn from them. And also, I understand there's a lot of people here that are in the business, and because we want to be in innovation, want to be the port that has learned from the experience, and also bring the technology in order to be very fast. Like you say, I don't know if workforce or technology is going to be the name of the game. Something that we need to value, but at the end, what we want is to be fast, deliver the goods to wherever they need to be delivered on time. Customs, immigration, also to be very fast and with the new technology. So that's what we are. I have two colleagues on me that are here. They also are invited to come because we need to learn also in order to be the port of the future. And the reason I say the port of the future, not competing, because I'm coming to learn, is be an example for the new ports to come that we need to protect the world, but at the same time we need to be fast. And that's probably my answer.
Great. Jonathan, why don't we go to you next on this one?
You look at ways, and you're right, Beth, in so many ways. Your decision-making process, I think the ports of old made decision-making process inside the gates. Whether you were 500 acres or 5,000 acres, it didn't matter. Everything was done on an internal evaluation. The efficient ports these days and ports that are hemmed in urban areas oftentimes need to take a look at what's called the transportation mesh. How do we layer the various modes of transportation as close as is possible in order to allow the shippers, the carriers, the people that move through that transportation mesh the most efficient option as is possible? So if you take a look at Port Everglades with its deepwater port, we have an ICTF, Intermodal Container Transfer Facility, on dock rail, right on board. We are immediately adjacent to Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport, and we are the terminus for 595. We're within a mile or two of 95. And essentially, with the redevelopment of a program that we have with our main entrance point, we will remove the last impediment, and that's one light. So you'll be able to go from dockside all the way to Southern California without hitting a single traffic light. And that's in the next few years. Now, ultimately, 80% of the cargo that we handle is consumed in South Florida, or within 80 miles. In fact, 69% of all of our inbound cargo is consumed in Miami-Dade County. You can thank us now.
Thank you, Jonathan.
But we rely on each other. But the only way that works is the ability to move it out efficiently, to get off the dock as expeditiously as possible. But let's leave the port behind for a moment, because the efficiency of that transportation mesh, of the highway system, of the distribution system, of the rail system, and even in many respects air, all of that has to be as efficient as everything else. Now, what we are starting to see now is that because we don't have the type of property that's necessary for us to have that distribution center mentality, is we're seeing the private sector that's stepping in. Their building right now under construction is 400,000 square feet in 2 different facilities just outside our gates. We have CGIS, which is developing CGIS at Port Everglades and Bridgepoint. Both of them are building 200,000 square foot dry cargo warehouses. Again, in close proximity to the rail, in close proximity to the highway, in close proximity to deepwater seaport. But ultimately, they're making, and I want to bring Nick in on this, because they're making that decision because the analytics are showing that the ports themselves, and we do know that some shippers and carriers that are using PortMiami probably will use these facilities as well. They're using the analytics and understanding that growth of the seaports, growth of the transportation nodes that we do have in South Florida are necessitating the need for additional industrial development. So ultimately, all works together. If we look at our ports just individually, we will fail. We must look at them in totality and holistically in order for South Florida to continue to grow. I mean, our numbers are growing just by leaps and bounds. but also the ability to take that discretionary cargo and be able to move that into the rest of the logistics network.
So to add on to that, Andy, before we jump into your remarks here, when you think about all that, there's a lot of discussion about physical infrastructure that is being adapted for this, but then there's what you mentioned about analytics. And what is the role of what data can play and analytics in terms of helping all of these flows throughout the entire ecosystem and data sharing and what have you. I know you're looking at your master planning process and things that you're going to consider there. Would love to hear in terms of building the efficiencies and the transitions between modes in the ecosystem if you're thinking about things along those lines. And of course, Nick, you're probably involved in that conversation as well. So Andy, maybe first to you, and then Nick to you.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief. First, everything Jonathan said, and I'll leverage off the word holistic solutions. And we have similar infrastructure, a great tunnel that leads you right out into the interstate system and what have you. But when the original question was about emissions, you cannot unlink emissions, safety, congestion, and security. So on the infrastructure part first, every time we can move cargo efficiently off port using a mode that's more emissions friendly, say rail versus truck, electric locomotive instead of diesel locomotive, that's all to the benefit. The pandemic exposed some of the things that are wrong with the supply chain. It didn't create it. So the ability to pivot and be nimble is absolutely critical. We were dealing with, 15 years ago, what do you do with this influx of more production coming out of Asia? Now we're dealing with same-day delivery in an urban area. And the solutions for that are totally different. So stakeholders are absolutely critical and partners are absolutely critical. Having sufficient flexibility to flex as demand grows and shrinks is something where the public sector can play a role because we're not the for-profit piece of the supply chain. As far as the technology goes, it's interesting. It's in some ways it's overwhelming. The plethora of options that are out there now. If you want to go on Google and say best supply chain and logistics software, you got to go through a list of 10,000 possibilities. How do you deal with that? But figuring out how to link together data visibility and transparency, which can be eye-opening, but execution platforms against that data, and then exception management and where does AI play a role, is a very complicated but very promising opportunity that folks are trying to figure out.
Nick, anything you'd like to add to this conversation?
Yeah, so just piggybacking off of that, I'd say it's very early days, and I think we all acknowledge that freight, logistics, shipping, ports is an industry that could benefit from technology. There's a lot of data silos, there's a lot of paper processes, et cetera. But at the same time, the application of analytics data is not a silver bullet. There are considerations like labor. I think, a couple years ago at the Port of LA, when there were those significant supply chain disruptions, part of it was fluctuations in demand due to COVID, et cetera. Part of it was just because there was a labor strike. And, there are the sort of like nuts and bolts realities of an on-the-ground logistics operation that it's not clear to me that technology can solve. And maybe that's refreshing for someone who is trying to bring technology to the space to say that, we're part of a solution, but it's holistic, and how do we optimize as opposed to just try and like junk and replace. I think that's maybe what I'd want to throw in here.
Well, and since you mentioned that, to talk about labor just a little bit, we've talked about data and whatnot. There are other enhancements that probably could be brought to bear by, leveraging automation. I know, Jonathan, I've heard you say before that's an enhancement to your labor force and helping to make their roles easier. And I think it would be interesting to kind of maybe talk about that, finesse that a little bit, as opposed to what folks typically think about when they think about automation, particularly in the transportation space. So I want to make sure you each get to weigh in on that.
You want to go? Hey, you want to take it first?
No, I'll take
Go right
first
ahead.
crack. Labor is always good to step up first on, right? We have on a core part of the operation, we have international longshoremen, unionized labor, out in the cargo yards, out on the berths, on the cruise berths. We have an excellent relationship with them, but you need to deal with work jurisdiction and work rules. They've been very good partners when it comes to optimizing. We tend to stay away from automation. But how do we do things? How does their productivity increase? That is all part of what plays into it. How do you reduce touches? How do you move closer? How do you move faster? Which again is cost, it's emissions, it's productivity, and ultimately it gives us supply chain capacity. In terms of ancillary or touch point labor, I can only speak for myself, but hiring is difficult right now. Both just even having a pool of potential labor, let alone pricing, let alone work from home environment, all of the things that we're dealing with. And that's where I think ultimately, I had a conversation with the Federal Reserve and I asked them what they're seeing about labor, and they said, and this is in non-union environments, people are jumping on the automation bandwagon and the AI bandwagon, and if labor is tight, then we can solve it without creating labor disruption. But those are all parts of the puzzle we're trying to work through.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, I think we're very fortunate on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast is that we have relative labor peace. And if you want to take a look in South Florida, we have extreme labor peace. At Port Everglades, we have a combination. The lead union that we have is the ILA, International Longshoremen's Association. We actually have two of the locals that work. We also have Teamsters that work in one of our terminals. And then to throw the complexity into it, we have some terminals that are non-union. And there are instances when the ILA may be working the vessel, handing it off to a non-union operation. It's critical that we maintain a level of communications. But automation, while that has a bad connotation to it, the utilization of data efficiencies to be able to put technology in place that enhances and creates a safer work environment. What we do is inherently dangerous. When we get a call that there's been an accident, typically it's a bad accident. And we had one probably 6 or 8 months ago where we had a young longshoreman that actually ended up losing their life. So when things happen and when you get that call, it has a tendency to be very bad. There's technology that's in place, everything from taking a look at the data associated with swing rates based on weather, based on just the flow of cargo, to make sure that we're giving our people the best information as possible to make sure that they're out of basically the line of fire. We're also trying to create efficiencies by utilizing some more passive technologies that are out there, and that's just utilizing CCTV and allowing for the companies that are dispatching the trucks into the port, especially early morning, that they're able to get onto a port site, they're able to get onto the app, see what type of queue lines that we have in place. It's 9 o'clock in the morning. They can take a look at it, and if it's 9 o'clock in the morning, it goes all the way back to Eller. They know don't dispatch at that time. So we're running that, and then we'll be putting 2 of our terminal operators will be bringing in brand new terminal operating systems with new appointment systems. On top of that, we are looking at ways in which we can cooperate between Miami and Port Everglades. RFID tags. We should have the same technology, the same readers, whether you're in Miami or that truck leaves Miami, picks up a box, and then brings their next box into Port Everglades. That truck itself should have the same RFID tag. It shouldn't matter. The technology should be the same, and ultimately we are enhancing efficiency within our port network and keeping congestion off of South Florida's roads, which anybody who's driven in South Florida recently realized that is an issue.
And Nick, since Jonathan brought up RFID tags and interoperability and having consistency, what are you seeing out there, and do you have, I guess, a position on that?
Sure. I would just say that there is a definite demand amongst our customers to integrate our technology with existing technology that they have for data to be fluid and not siloed. And I think it's coming from a place where they recognize that technology is ultimately a competitive advantage. I mean, ports are being paid for the amount of cargo that they can move. So the more cargo they move, the more money they make. So if you can really adopt these technologies in order to get the most efficiency gains out of maybe, we take data out of sensors, past hardware investments you've made, if you can upskill the labor that you have. So instead of, maybe monitoring a bunch of CCTVs or like record logs, they're looking through like an automated sort of manifest or like dashboard system. You yourself are going to become this more attractive destination for a shipper to send cargo. It's only something that I think behooves the adoption of the technology.
And Kurt, in terms of you're visioning ahead. You don't have any existing, I guess, structures, restrictions, or whatnot. How are you looking at this? Because I know you've been talking with innovators all over the world and trying to plan for Punta Colonet. How are you looking at this as you start from scratch?
Well, again, I need to see the consumer, who is going to be using the chip and our port. And at the end, everybody wants to have their goods on time, either in San Diego or in Texas or in Chicago. So we need to find ways to make it when he says something very, very important. In COVID, the Long Beach, the problem was not they don't have the ability to load and unload. It was not the people. And they have no people because they needed to be at home. So if I hope never happens again, but if that happens again or something similar happens again, we won't have the same problem. So we need to find ways and technology that we can anticipate and don't have that problem again. So the consumer at the end can have their goods at their home or wherever they need it on time. So that's what I want, or we want. And that's why I'm here. I'm learning a lot from the experience. Something that he said that Tim and Miguel, who are with me, we want to start talking with them and see what we can do to innovate. And again, that's what we want, to have a port that is fast, that is easy to come and go, because it's not only to bring goods, but also to export. And our location is very good. We want to have train, and he's saying something very interesting that we are already talking with UP, Union Pacific, about that. We want to expand our airport in Mexicali to make it aerospace and be used on cargo too. To put the goods fast all over the world, but especially in North America.
Great, thank you. And we have time for maybe about 2 questions. Does anyone have a question for the panel? Feel free, we have microphones. There are microphones there, or you can project.
Well, first, I want to address a question, and then I will add something to help Kurt in his presentation, which was outstanding, by the way. The question is for the 2 ports, Port Everglades and Port of Miami. Obviously, the big problem that you have for development is the lack of space. And both of you belong to different counties at the end, and that, in essence, makes you to compete. But wouldn't it be for you easier if you try to go to an upper government level and try to actually be one single port entity and probably segregate the different types of activities, and in order to become stronger, increase capacity and share assets, or even go to future development with as a complementary port and as a whole port system rather than 2 ports with the same cargoes competing each. I'm thinking that's a big dilemma for you.
Did you think about that question coming?
Yes. I'll take a shot. That's a very Interesting question, and I'll start by this. Political governance and structure is so far above my head I can't even see it. So I don't want to speak for Jonathan, but we compete as friends. And how that works, and while it's not a uniform structure under which we both operate, is that we force to be as good as we can in the market, because if we're not, Port Everglades becomes an option. When it comes to bigger issues for South Florida to service the state, the region, and the country, deeper dredging at Port Everglades, we've been extremely supportive. We will speak to it in Washington, D.C. Jonathan has been equally supportive on things that we're trying to do. So we can compete on a particular service level or a particular pricing dynamic, but I know through the 3 years that Jonathan has been here, when we look at shifts in trade, when we look at the burgeoning population that all seems to be moving to Florida, the number one business startup state in the country, we collectively have to figure out how to service that, and I think we do a pretty good job.
I'll be brief on this, and that's going to be a discussion point for the administration that's above our level. We're fortunate in the state of Florida, and we took our story out west a couple of years ago during the congestion in Southern California. Under the Florida Ports Council, where we have 16 port jurisdictions, 16 ports, 15 operating right now, we're fortunate enough is that it's a Florida first mentality. Let's get it into the state of Florida first. Then we're going to let all of us compete over what is the best option. We are extremely fortunate in South Florida actually to have 3 deepwater ports: Port of Palm Beach, Port Everglades, Port Miami. So if it's break bulk, it's going to go probably into a specific area. If it's east-west trade, it's going to go into another port. If it's north-south trade, it's going to go into another port. On the cruise side, we complement each other. We look at more of the ultra-high luxury and luxury and premium brands, and the larger vessels are coming into Miami because of the investments that are being made there. We have the best of all worlds, is that we have ports that compete in many respects, which makes us more efficient and better for the shippers and the carriers. At the same time, we have the infrastructure and close proximity to handle just about anything that any shipper or carrier throws at us.
And just so everyone knows, Jonathan is also the chair of the Florida Ports Council. So while there is competition amongst our ports, there's great collaboration to move the entire industry forward. We're actually out of time, but I want to ask I'm going to shorten this to a sound bite. The sound bite is there a sound bite that you want to leave this audience with after what we've discussed, or something that was missed? And we'll just kind of go down the line here, and we'll start with you, Andy.
Yeah, if you want to ascribe to the goals of CoMotion, you have to be nimble and figure out how to pivot on a dime.
I would do that. On top of that, I'd throw just the collaboration and the need for the use of technology in some form into the future.
I'd say good is better than perfect. A lot of these pieces of infrastructure already have what they need in order to optimize their own operations, and the key is just starting.
And me, our next board director of Punta Colonet, in the curriculum have to be a football coach.
That's great. That's great. Well, let's thank our panel. I want to also mention, this is the start of a discussion. There is a workshop tomorrow at 11:30 that will take a deeper dive into all of this. So please join us at that workshop. And I know, Jonathan, you'll be joining us, and Kurt, you'll be joining us. So see us there. You can also ask more of your questions as well here and also at the workshop. All right, so everybody enjoy the rest of the conference.